Good morning.
Morning.
What I would like to do this morning is really three things. One, finish our discussion of federalism and political conflict. Number two, to give you a very current example of the kind of thing Schachtschneider is talking about and how one can analyze it. And then three, to talk about the second paper assignment. So keep in mind that Schachtschneider talks about democracy as the socialization of conflict. One way to think about that is to think about politics and American government as a theater. In fact, the metaphor of a theater or a theatrical approach to social and political life is very commonplace among social scientists. And perhaps oversimply, a theater involves at least two sets of actors who may or may not remain fixed in their role in political life. And one is the actors themselves, and the other is the members of the audience. And so what Schachtschneider is talking about when he talks about democracy as the socialization of conflict is that politics can be understood. One way of understanding politics is in terms of the number of political actors there are and the size of the audience. So some political actors in American government want the size of the audience to be very small because they think they can win with a small audience. Others want a much larger audience of a conflict so that they would be more likely to achieve their political objectives. Let me try to give you one concrete example. It's well known that spousal abuse and child abuse are serious problems in American society. And very often these cases of abuse, which are, I'm sure, in the tens and tens of thousands every year, many of them involve acts of violence perpetrated by one person on another, or sometimes more than one, sometimes directed at more than one person. And these usually occur either in household and family settings. Some people might say, well, spousal and child abuse really is a private matter and should not be a matter of government and law at all. And people should be able to, usually men, should be able to beat up on their spouses and their children whenever they like with impunity, and the government, police, laws should not be involved in any way, shape, or form. Others say, no, that's really a bad idea for our society, and we need to protect people against acts of violence, even if it's perpetrated by family members on other family members. And so we need laws to prevent this or to discourage people from doing it, and to hold people accountable under the law if they do it. So the idea of a small audience is one that says, well, government really shouldn't be involved in this. There should be no laws about spousal or child abuse. A different approach would be to say, yes, we need a larger audience. We need more people involved, mental health professionals. We need city councils or legislative bodies. We need government agencies to protect people. We need police officers to intervene, that kind of thing. So with regard to any public policy, one of the questions has to do not only with which forum or forums will the policy be addressed in, and the conflict be looked at, but also who's going to be involved and exactly who's going to be looking at the issue and witnessing it from the audience. So basically what we suggested last time, I'm going to move to the bottom of the screen here, is that federalism is a kind of three-ring circus with federal, state, and local governments, as we already know, and that political actors will generally seek to find the political arena or venue where the distribution of actors and audience is most favorable to the policy outcome that they desire. The assumption behind that argument is that people who participate in politics and people who hold public office have policy preferences. That they're not just there to get a paycheck, they're not just there to get good benefits, they're not just there to serve their own interests, but that they do prefer, they do have certain political values, they do have certain policy preferences, and that they're in government or participating in politics because they want some policies to be adopted and implemented rather than others. So, if one looks at the history of, relatively recent history, post-World War II history, of public policy in the United States, we see that those who supported segregation, those who support suppression or denial of civil and voting rights, are most likely to support greater powers for the states. Remember that the whole issue of reapportionment came up because in the 1960s was because the states never reapportioned their legislative districts, and so as a consequence, the nature of political representation was totally off kilter. Then we see some important policy, public policy, national public policy legislation in the 1960s and 70s. And it's often said that the war on poverty, which essentially lasted for 2 years, was a failure. Needless to say, there's very good reason to think that poverty as a problem in our society is so large and so complicated that the idea that it could be in any manner affected by 2 years of public policy or two years of new laws, that really is not a very realistic idea. And so after about maybe 2.5 years, the Great Society programs of the Johnson administration began to be cut back and opposed in a variety of ways, and national government policies began to shift. The idea behind the Great Society programs is that, in fact, there are some important national domestic policy problems and needs that the Congress and the national government need to address. Beginning in late 1967, 1968, and continuing thereafter, that basic and fundamental claim has been under attack, and I want to try to explain how that's been, how you can see that. First of all, there's in early 1970, I believe, I want to say 1972, the Congress passed revenue sharing legislation. The purpose of revenue sharing legislation was to say to the states, for Washington, the federal government, to say to the states, we're not going to tell you what to do. You know that we've given you more and more and more money year after year. We talked about intergovernmental transfers. Well, we're not going to micromanage, we're not going to set guidelines, we're not going to do anything, we're just going to give you that money because we think, this is what the Congress was saying and the President Nixon was saying, we think people, officials at the state and local level are better able to determine how those funds should be used. So no strings attached whatsoever, and revenue sharing at the time was the #1 vehicle for intergovernmental transfers. That is, monies going from the federal government to state and local governments. In 1974, the Community Development Block Grant Program was adopted as part of the Housing and Community Development Act. And this is the first major case of block grant legislation coming out of Washington. And basically what a block grant did and is to take a great number of federal programs, merge them, and give administrative authority and resources to state and local governments to sort through and administer the policies or the programs rather, as they saw fit. And so more broadly, this process of shifting responsibility and management and funding of domestic policy programs, which had been primarily federal, at least under the design of President Johnson, in the 1960s, moved toward much greater, much more substantial control of domestic policy programs by state and local governments and officials. And this continued, for example, through the Clinton administration and the welfare reform legislation that President Clinton signed in 1996. And really continues today, even in the Affordable Care Act. So, what are the impacts of federalism on American national government? I do not think these are necessarily good, bad, or in between. That's not my argument. What I'm trying to do is look at governmental structures established in our Constitution and to ask the question, what are the impacts of this constitutional design? So the first is there is no fixed, inflexible understanding either in the Constitution or in the jurisprudence, the federal jurisprudence, about how powers should be distributed within the federal system. There is, of course, the supremacy clause in Article 6. However, it's important to remember that the Constitution and the words in the Constitution are not self-implementing. They're not self-enforcing. Between the Constitution and the people is a whole range of governmental bodies, nearly 100,000. And that's not even counting individual agencies. And this was not just a matter of a political compromise between those who wanted a stronger national government and those who wanted more power to the states, but it was a requirement in order to get the Constitution ratified, and it reflected the political realities of the time. And so one of the enduring themes and tensions in American national government is what should the distribution of power be between the federal government and state governments, and where does the authority lie? Second, there are multiple points for citizens and groups to have access to the political process and to governmental institutions. And there are many veto points, places where legislation or governmental action can be stopped or halted. And so we see this all the time. We're seeing the veto points, for example, just this, in the last couple of weeks with regard to the president's actions on immigration reform and federal court ruling that put those on hold. So what this framework does, what this institutional framework does, the framework of federalism and separation of powers, is it creates multiple political forms, multiple political arenas where people and groups and interests need to somehow come to an agreement in order for anything to happen. So the structure, the very structure of American government that the framers designed makes change very difficult. The advantage in almost any policy issue is to those who want to maintain things as they are. So anybody who wants change has a challenge before them because of the very structure of our institutions. Another consequence of this, and this is the example I want to show you later, is what's called a two-step policy process or a two-step policy conflict. What the Constitution does and what the federal system does is that before we can decide what a policy or law should be, we first have to ask two questions that are very debatable and around which there's going to be a lot of disagreement. The first question is this even something government should do? Should government do anything about this? This is in a sense, what is the scope of government? Should government be doing this or interested in this problem, policy, condition, whatever, issue, whatever you want to call it? And then secondly, if government should have a role, the question is, which government? Should it be the national government? Should it be state governments? Should it be both? Who should address this issue? A subsequent question then exists for those who want to initiate some kind of public policy change. And that is, what kind of strategy should we adopt in order to make change? Should it be focused on the federal government? Should it be focused on state governments? Should it be local governments? Should it be through political parties or social movements? How should this be done? And so what I'd like to do, what I'm saying then, is that this also drags out the political process and any process of political change. Because before you can ask, what should the policy be, the question that will almost always come prior to that is, should we do this and where should it be done? And so the second paper assignment is designed to explore the question of federalism, and we'll talk more about that in a second. So I wanted to give you an example, if I can find it here. So far I can't. Oops. Okay. So I hope you read this. I posted it yesterday, several places. And I want you to understand that this is how one can do some political analysis of policy conflict in American national government. As you're probably aware, the President of the United States recently vetoed the Keystone XL pipeline bill that was approved by Congress. My discussion here is not to deal with whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I am not taking any position on whether Keystone ought to be built or whether it shouldn't be built. That is not my point, nor is it the point with respect to the paper assignment that we'll be talking about in a minute. But I wanted to show you this veto message that the President wrote so that you can see what I'm talking about when I mention that there's a two-step policy process. So the first sentence in his message is, he doesn't even use the word, but basically he's saying, I'm vetoing this bill. And the second sentence says, Congress is attempting to circumvent long-standing and proven processes for determining whether or not building and operating a cross-border pipeline serves the national interest. The important part of this sentence, the most important part of this sentence, from my argument, is the first half of it. In other words, what is the President saying here? And again, I'm not saying I agree. I'm not saying I disagree. I'm trying to point out how this issue reflects what we've just talked about in terms of Schachtschneider's analysis of democracy as the socialization of conflict. So what the President is saying here is that there's a normal way of doing things. We have, as Commander-in-Chief, he's saying, I have to implement the law. And we have a process that's ongoing, that's been done for many years to study issues like this. And we're currently studying this issue. In fact, he doesn't mention where, but it's in the Department of State, among other places. So we have an ongoing study of whether or not this is a good policy idea. We have an ongoing study of the costs and consequences of building the Keystone Pipeline. He might also have said, we have people in the States. He doesn't say this. He could say lots of things, okay? He could say, this is bad for the economy. Or he could say, we already have a glut of oil and natural gas. Or he could say, this is an environmental hazard. Or he could say, we just had 4 explosions of oil and natural gas facilities in the past week, and we don't need any more. He could have said all kinds of things. But that's not what he did. What he did was to make a procedural argument. Who ought to be looking at this now? Okay? It's the two-step policy process. He does say at the end of that second sentence and at the end of the second paragraph that maybe there are serious policy issues, but he goes into no detail at all. The emphasis in the statement is we've got long-standing and proven ways of analyzing these kinds of policies. And he goes on further in the paragraph 2, this act of Congress conflicts with established executive branch procedures and cuts short thorough consideration of issues. What is he saying? He's saying, Congress, what are you doing? You shouldn't be considering this now. Let's get the evidence. Let's allow the executive branch department to finish its thorough study of this issue. He's not saying this is a bad idea, we shouldn't do it, we shouldn't build this pipeline. He's saying you really are not the folks who should be opining on this issue at this time. He's making a process argument. He's making an argument about how issues should be studied thoroughly before laws are passed. And the implicit criticism of Congress is you really haven't studied this thoroughly, and you haven't respected the normal process which allows that study to come to its conclusion. So this fits in with the discussion of the two-step policy process that we talked about. Only it's not federal-state. The president is saying this is an issue that currently is being studied in the executive branch. The implication is Congress hasn't studied it with any kind of thoroughness. You don't have enough information. The thorough study is being done in the Department of State or in some other executive branch agency, and therefore wait till it's done, and then let's look at what the study recommends. Let's look at its findings. So this is the kind of thing that happens in a two-step policy process. He's saying not that this is bad policy and should never be done. He's saying you're not doing this right. The procedure is not right. The decision-making arena is not yours at this time. And by doing so, the president doesn't have to make an explicit policy argument. He's saying there's certain ways to do things in an intelligent way, in a mindful way that allows for the full and thorough and comprehensive assessment of a policy issue, and you just cut in line, and I'm not having it. Your time has not yet come to consider this issue. So this is an example of what I'm talking about. The only difference is it's not a federal-state issue, at least in terms of the way the president is describing it. It is the case that there's community organizations and community groups and states and state courts that have also taken up this issue, either in favor of it or opposed to it, but he doesn't talk about that. And that's the federal-state dimension of it. The president's just looking at it in terms of the appropriate process. What he says is the appropriate process in the federal government. Any comments or questions about this?
No.
If you do, please ask them.
No.
Okay. So again, my point here is not to say the president is either right, wrong, or in between. My point is not to say that the keystone is either good, bad, or in between. My point is this rhetoric sets forth a political strategy about how decisions should be made, and that there needs to be an understanding about how decisions are made and who makes them, what's the process before you actually make them. Okay, I have to go all the way to the other end here. Okay, with respect to paper 2, I would urge you to go back to the assignments box on Blackboard and to read very, very, very carefully the guidelines for writing a paper. If you do not pay attention to these guidelines, they're there for a reason, and that reason is to help you write a better paper than you otherwise would. So please review them. If you have questions about them, please feel free to post them, your questions, on the help forum. Our next class will be Monday morning at 9:45, and the paper is not due until March 18th. You can turn it in before then if you like, but please review these guidelines with care. What I want to do for the rest of the morning which will probably, it take some minutes, is just to look at and to try to explain the assignment. And so the questions that your paper should address are at the top of this slide. And this is a very, very, very hard question. I'll make no bones about it. And it's a really important and interesting one, because there are good arguments on both sides. So the question rests on our prior discussion of what I call the ambiguous nature or character of American federalism. And I'm just going to start to read it and then maybe talk about it. You may have questions, and when you do, please interrupt me. Critics of the states hold that federalism enables powerful state and local interests to prevent change, to impede and distort national policies, to exaggerate social and political inequalities, and expand their own power at the expense of American citizens. I've made that argument, and the text makes that argument. They tend to claim that the institutions, that is the critics, that the institutions of the federal government are better able to introduce political change. Supporters of a broader policymaking role for states tend to view the states as experimental laboratories that try out and assess new government initiatives and policies. And I spoke to you about how I think that that's a strong argument. This view basically holds that states are better able to initiate political change than the federal government. So, political observers and actors also have different views about the role of the different branches of government and the role of social movements in bringing about political and social change. I've just got done saying that the design of our political system makes change pretty difficult, and that the disagreements of critics and support of those who argue one or another position about the federal system is in part a question about how best to make political change. So this assignment asks students to weigh in on these issues by conducting research on one of the most pronounced and rapid political changes in recent American political life, the legalization of gay marriage in the United States. In short, we want to use gay marriage as one window on the debate about the character of federalism and political change, and of the role of governmental institutions and social movements, and for that matter, other political actors, in making policy change possible. Let me be clear, and this is, you'll also find this later in the assignment information. I am not interested in whether people are, whether they support, whether students in the class support gay marriage or civil union or oppose gay marriage and civil union. That has nothing really to do with the assignment. The reason I picked gay marriage is because of the following, the fourth bullet. Until September 1, 2009, gay marriage was prohibited in all 50 states and the District of Columbia. Today, gay marriage is legal in at least 37 states and Washington, D.C. I think we can assume this is a relatively swift, from one point of view, a relatively swift political and social change. This is not normal. Yes, one can argue, well, for decades, it wasn't legal. Okay, and that's true. But the point is, here is a very, in the context of American political history and national government, this is a very rapid change. and a dramatic change. And so the question that I want you to address is not whether gay marriage is a good, bad, or in-between policy. That's not the issue. The issue is, how in the hell did this happen? Who was involved? What institutions? What political actors? How do I make sense of the federal system and its ability to produce political change as a consequence of looking at this issue? So, methodology of the assignment. Students whose last name begin with the letter A through L should conduct research on the gay marriage issue in the states where it's now legal. And if, you can go online and you can see which 37 states. Obviously, you can't do research on all 37 states. Students whose last name begins with the letter M through Z should conduct research on the gay marriage issue in the states where it remains illegal. So we have two samples here. We have one sample of states where it became legal. We have another sample of states where it's still illegal. So one group of states has political change. Another group does not. Okay, so those with the last name that begin A through L should describe and analyze how and why gay marriage became legal in those states. How did it happen? What was done in terms of governmental action? The second group should describe and analyze how and why it remains prohibited in the states where it's not legal. Now, this is the important point, and that's why it is bold. In each case, students should identify the key political actors and decision makers who either brought about or are preventing political change. These might include executive, legislative, and judicial actors in the states and or federal government, political parties and their elected officials, interest groups, and social movements, and maybe the media for all I know. All students should then explain and evaluate how their findings affect their understanding of the role of federalism, the branches of government, and social movements in this political change. In sum, are states laboratories of political change, or do parochial interests in the states resist political change? In fact, you're going to probably find both. Or are there other explanations of this political change, such as the role of different branches of government and party officials, interest groups, and social movements? So I've just got done, and this is not an unusual view among political scientists who teach American government. The political change in American national government tends to be slow. Incremental is the word that's often used. So here we have change that is, over time, relatively swift and is not incremental at all. So how do you explain what happened? Who are the actors? How did this happen over a period of, say, 5 or 6 years? That's the question. What political processes, what governmental institutions, which political actors, which political party, which social movements? How did this happen? So I'm asking you to do research. Most of it's going to be probably based on internet sources, and you should feel free to ask me the difference between a decent and a ridiculous internet source and journalism. You can go through Google News or any other web news site, Huffington Post or what have you, to get news about how this happened. Again, I'm not asking you to take a policy position or a political position on whether you think this is a good or bad idea. I want you to be able to say, where did this happen? Tell me. How did it happen? Who was involved? Who are the actors? Who are the audience? Okay? Using Schachtschneider's terminology, or at least a kind of theatrical approach to politics. Who were the players? What were the arenas? Was it legislative bodies? Was it courts? Was it presidents? What was it? So, as I said, this assignment does not ask you to take a position on the issue. Rather, the assignment is about the nature of the federal system, branches of government, social movements, and political change. We're using one policy question to examine the sources of political and policy change and resistance. So, do you have questions about this assignment?
No.
If you do, if you don't understand anything I've said, and by the way, I've posted this again, please come forward and ask them right now.
Is everybody good?
Any questions or comments? Let me try to.
Yes, no question.
Go ahead. Is there a question?
We don't have any questions.
Okay. One final point I'll make, and then we can call it a day, and that is this. This assignment is embedded in a disagreement among political actors, political officials, and political scientists about how change comes about in American national government. Okay? There is no agreement. There is no agreement. There are differing views. That's perfectly fine. So what I wanted to do was take an example of a pretty rapid change, at least from one point of view, to take a look at that and say, okay, how did this happen? Let's study it, and then let's, if we can, make a determination about how change comes about in the federal system. Keep in mind one other thing, and then we'll call it a day, and that is change might be different for different issues. Okay? There's no law that says policy change that happened with respect to gay marriage in American government and politics. There's no law that says it has to happen the same way for a very different kind of issue, or for any other issue. So this is a one-case study so that you can understand and can do the analysis of how it is that political change like this came about, and then how we understand the role of the federal system in that change. So if there are no questions, we'll call it a day, and you guys have a good week, and I'll see you Monday morning. And Monday morning, I will probably start by talking just for a few minutes on civil liberties. All of the lectures, video lectures on civil liberties are there. I don't need to repeat them. You should have seen them by Monday morning if you haven't already. And you should also have seen the first 12 slides of the civil rights video, and then I'll go through that very quickly and then do the rest on civil rights. Okay, take care. Have a good rest of the week.